One wagon, 4 bodies, one woman still breathing. Elias Cole had buried his faith in miracles beside his wife until smoke led him to Clara, bleeding in the Montana dirt, clutching a brass locket like the last prayer she had left. The smoke was 2 miles out, maybe less. 3 columns, thick and black, the kind that didn't come from a campfire or a cook stove. Elias Cole pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge and didn't say anything for a moment, just counted. 3 fires, spread over maybe a quarter-mile of open ground. Someone had wanted to be thorough. Beside him, Tommy sat on his spotted mare with the careful, neutral expression he'd been developing since before Elias found him, the face that meant he was paying attention and wasn't going to make a sound about it. The boy had good instincts, better than most grown men Elias had ridden with. "That's bad smoke," Tommy said. "Yeah?" Elias's right hand found the cord around his neck without instruction, the thin leather string, the gold band threaded through it, worn smooth from 3 years of this same motion, this same press against his chest through his shirt. He did it before he knew he was doing it. He always did. "Stay close to me." They picked their way down the ridge in the low afternoon light, the October cold already sharpening at the edges, the smell reaching them before the sight did. Scorched canvas, burnt wood, something underneath both of those that Elias recognized and chose not to name out loud because Tommy was 9 years old and some things didn't need names until they couldn't be avoided. He found the wagon half a mile off the main trail, tipped sideways onto the dry grass like a man who'd finally stopped arguing with gravity. It had burned down to its frame ribs, the canvas dissolved to black lace, 2 of the wheel horses dead in their traces, shot clean through the head. Neither of them had time to panic about it. A third had broken free and was nowhere to be seen. The trunks that had been loaded in the wagon bed were scattered across 40 feet of ground. Clothes, linens, personal effects, things that had belonged to a life that no longer required them, like something had turned the whole cargo inside out, looking for whatever it wanted. Elias got off his horse. He counted 4 bodies, the way his father had taught him to count anything dangerous, quickly, with the number coming first, and the feeling coming later, if at all. 4. 3 men in hired hand clothes, all carrying irons they hadn't gotten to draw. This had been fast, decisive, the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had no interest in discussion. And 1 woman in a grey wool traveling dress, 60 years old if she was a day, shot once at close range with an expression on her face that had settled somewhere between surprise and resignation, as if she'd had just enough time to understand what was happening and not quite enough to do anything about it. He checked each of them. None of them were breathing. "Sit your horse," he told Tommy, who had come up alongside him on the spotted mare. "Don't look directly at them if you can help it." "I've seen dead people before," the boy said. Not defensively, just accurately. "I know you have." He put a hand briefly on the mare's neck, which was the closest he could come to saying what he meant. "Sit your horse anyway." He moved through the wreckage slowly, checking, cataloguing. No shell casings. Revolvers, not rifles. 8 or 9 riders from the track marks in the soft ground near the wheel ruts, approaching from the northwest, departing heading east. That was toward Cascade Valley. That was Whitmore country, or so he'd been told in the last 2 towns that mentioned the name. He was crouching over a scattered heap of silk and ruined hatboxes when he heard it. A sound, small and ragged and wrong, but alive. It came from beneath the tipped wagon frame, from the narrow, dark gap between the side panel and the ground, a space no bigger than a good shadow, the kind of space that shouldn't fit a person, but apparently did. He dropped to 1 knee in the dirt and pressed his face close to the gap. She was there. She had folded herself into that space, the way something folded itself when it was trying to become smaller than its own fear. Knees drawn up, arms locked around her ribcage, her face turned sideways toward the sliver of afternoon light, with her eyes half open and focused on nothing that was actually in front of her. The dress she wore had been cream-colored once. Fine, heavy silk, the kind of dress that didn't belong in ranch country and cost more than Elias made in 3 months. It was torn at both shoulders and soaked dark at her left side. A gash at her hairline had dried in a line down her jaw. She was breathing in shallow, deliberate pulls. Like each breath was a separate decision she was making against considerable opposition. "Ma'am," his voice came out rough from a day of not using it. "I'm going to move this panel. Don't fight me." Her lips moved. Nothing came out. But her eyes tracked toward him, slowly, effortfully, the way eyes moved when the body was using every resource it had for something other than seeing. "Tommy," he didn't raise his voice. "I need you down here." The boy was off his horse and at Elias's side in 10 seconds flat, which was faster than some soldiers Elias had served alongside in the years he didn't talk about. Together, Elias taking the weight, Tommy anchoring from the opposite side, they shifted the panel enough to create space, and Elias reached in with both arms and drew her out slowly and carefully, the way you moved something broken that you didn't want to break worse. He laid her flat in the grass 15 feet from the smouldering frame and went to work with the efficiency the army had given him and the care that was entirely his own. Airway, breathing, bleeding, everything else in that order. The gash at her hairline had bled dramatically, but wasn't deep enough to be the primary danger. Head wounds perform for an audience that way. The left side of her ribcage was the primary danger. When he pressed careful fingers against the curve of her ribs, she made a sound that came from somewhere below conscious control and tried to pull away from his hands with a body that didn't have the capacity to follow through on the intention. 2, maybe 3, he said quietly, to himself more than anyone. Bruised or cracked. Not broken through. If they'd broken through and punctured anything important, she'd have been gone 2 hours ago. "Is she gonna die?" Tommy asked from 6 feet back. He was holding both horses with steady hands, watching with the particular calm of a child who had already learned that the world behaved according to its own interests, regardless of his feelings about the matter. "Not tonight." Elias kept his hands moving. "Get the tin box out of my left saddlebag, and the bedroll." He worked until the light failed. Cleaned the gash with whiskey he kept for exactly this kind of emergency, not the kind that came in a glass. Wrapped her ribs with a length of linen, firm but not tight, enough to support without restricting the shallow breathing she needed. Cut away the worst of the blood-soaked fabric at her left shoulder and found bruising underneath but no wound. She'd been thrown, not shot. The people who died around her had died between her and whoever was doing the shooting. Tommy built the fire without being asked. Small, low, heat without advertisement. Another skill he'd developed from necessity. Elias had started to catalogue these skills over the past 6 months. The quiet ones, the ones that kept a person alive without making noise about it. There were more of them every week. The October dark came down fast and complete, the way dark came down in Montana in the months before winter committed to the idea. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in the first hour after sunset. Elias had been in this territory long enough to feel the number in his joints. If you're the kind of person who stays with a story when the world tells you to keep walking, leave this one a like and tell me in the comments, have you ever helped a stranger when it cost you something real? She came back to consciousness just after the fire caught. It happened in stages, the way it always happened after a blow, the body assembling the information piece by piece and deciding what to do with it before it committed to being conscious. Her breathing changed first. Then her hands, which had been loose at her sides, closed slowly into fists. Then her eyes opened. Her right hand shot out and found his wrist with a grip that was stronger than he expected. Considerably stronger, iron strong. The grip of someone whose body knew danger, even when her mind was still sorting itself out. He kept still. People came out of shock in different ways, and some of them came out swinging. He waited and let her find him with her eyes. Brown eyes, dark as creek water after a 3-day rain, and behind the pain and the shock and the particular flatness of extreme stress, something was working. Something that was gathering itself, assembling a front, deciding what this new and terrible situation required her to be. "How many?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was the one piece of information she needed most urgently, and she was asking for it the way people asked for things they'd already decided to endure. "4," he said. "I'm sorry." The grip on his wrist loosened, not because she'd decided to trust him, that was too early. Because the answer had taken something out of her and there was simply nothing left to grip with. "They're all gone," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes closed. A single thin line of moisture tracked from the corner of her left eye into her hair, and then her face went still and composed in a way that cost her something visible to achieve. Whatever she was carrying, she had decided to carry it upright. Elias recognized that particular discipline. He had seen it in other people, and he used it himself every single day. "My name is Clara," she said finally, quietly, precisely, as if she was choosing each word before she spent it. "Just Clara. Elias Cole." He waited a moment, then added, "This is Tommy." The boy had been standing at the edge of the firelight, trying not to stare with mixed success. She turned her head toward him with visible effort, something in her expression adjusting, not false warmth, nothing performed, just genuine accommodation of a child, the specific register of someone who knew how to talk to people who weren't yet grown. "Hello, Tommy." Her voice found a steadiness from somewhere that impressed him. "How old are you?" "9, Tommy said, caught off guard by being addressed directly. "Almost 10. "Almost 10, she repeated. "That's very nearly grown." She said it as simple fact, not flattery. The boy absorbed it the same way, standing slightly straighter without seeming to notice he was doing it. Elias noticed. He fed her water in small amounts. A little, then a pause, then a little more. The way you fed water to someone whose system had been through a severe shock. She didn't fight him, and she didn't spill, which meant she had more control over her own body than it looked like, and more sense than most people he'd worked on in the field. When she fell asleep, real sleep, not the other kind, her breathing evening out into something deeper and less effortful, he sat back on his heels and looked at her face in the firelight for a moment. Fine-boned, a jaw with some decision in it, hands that were currently grimed with blood and dirt, but had been before today the hands of someone whose life did not involve physical labor, soft palms, clean nails, the particular softness that came from a certain kind of life in a certain kind of place. He looked through what remained of the wagon's scattered cargo without feeling good about it, but he needed to understand who she was, or at least who would be looking for her, before tomorrow became a problem. The leather traveling case had survived intact, monogrammed CEH in brass tacks. The contents were the possessions of a wealthy woman, 3 dresses of a quality that had no business this far west, each wrapped in tissue paper, a small tortoise-shell mirror, a bottle of French perfume that had survived when nearly everything else hadn't, silk things in a separate compartment, a tortoise-shell hairbrush with a matching comb. At the bottom, in a pocket sewn into the case's lining with deliberate concealment, a sealed envelope. He held the envelope in the firelight. He did not open it, but the name written on the outside was in a careful clerk's hand, Miss Clara Eliza Harrington, to be received at Whitmore Ranch, Cascade County, Montana Territory, upon arrival. He held it for long enough to understand what it meant, not long enough to let it change anything tonight. Gerald Whitmore. He had heard that name in 3 different towns over the past 4 months, and liked it less with each repetition. A rancher out of Cascade County who owned more land than made any sense, and ran it with the disposition of a man who had never once been told no. The kind of man whose patience was a weapon, the kind whose money bought silence before silence became necessary. He looked at the woman sleeping on his bedroll, the brass locket still clutched in her right hand, even in unconsciousness, holding it the way you held the one thing left. "Just Clara," she'd said. He set the envelope back in the case, closed the latch quietly, and slid it beneath the toppled wagon frame where it wouldn't catch anyone's eye. Whatever she had decided to be tonight, in this place, on this particular piece of cold ground, that was her decision to make. He had no business deciding it for her. He pressed the ring once through his shirt. Then he lay down on the cold ground, with his back to the fire and his rifle across his chest, barrel pointed toward the dark, facing outward the way he always faced when he slept, and counted the minutes and the stars and the sound of the wind in the dry grass. Tommy slept the way he always slept, instantly and completely, one hand curled under his jaw, entirely surrendered to it. Above them, the Montana sky was excessive in the way it always was out here, stars thick as spilled salt from one horizon to the other, cold and indifferent and enormous. The kind of sky that made everything under it feel very small and very specific at the same time. Something moved in the grass at the far edge of the firelight. Elias tracked it without moving his head until it resolved into a coyote. Curious, disappointed, eventually gone. He kept watching anyway. In the morning, he was going to have to decide what to do about the envelope, and what to do about the direction those tracks were heading. He didn't figure either decision was going to be simple. The fire had burned down to coals before first light, and Elias had let it die completely, moving the camp perimeter in the dark, the way he'd been doing since before Tommy, since before Mary, since the years he didn't name, checking angles, cataloguing sounds, filing the information away in the part of him that never fully stood down. She was sitting up when he came back, not easily. Nothing about it was easy. Her left arm pressed flat against her wrapped ribs, her right hand braced in the frost-stiff grass, holding herself upright with the focused stubbornness of a person who had made a decision against the advice of her body and was committed to it. She'd been awake for a while from the look of her, long enough to watch the sky go from black to grey, to the particular pale amber that came before the sun actually showed up and made promises. "You should be lying down," he said. "I've been lying down." Her voice was clearer than last night, the shock receding, something more organized moving in behind it. "I need to understand the situation." He built the fire back up without commenting on her being upright. Boiled water. Made coffee. Real coffee, ground beans from a cloth sack in his left saddlebag, one of 3 things he paid full price for without negotiating. He poured 2 cups and handed her one, and she took it with her right hand and drank before he started talking, which he appreciated. People who did the sensible thing before demanding explanations were easier to work with. 30 miles northeast of Harlow's Creek, he said, crouching across from her with his own cup. 2 days' ride in good conditions. "I can't ride," she said. Not a complaint, a variable she was accounting for. Travois tied to the roan. "Slow, but it'll hold your ribs." He paused. "I've done it before." She studied him for a moment with the specific quality of attention he was already beginning to recognize. Precise, patient, adding information to information, and then nodded once. No protest, no performance of helplessness, no negotiation for its own sake. Just agreed. Next problem. Tommy appeared from his bedroll, as if he'd been launched, already dressed, hair flat on the left side from sleeping, moving with the efficient morning energy of a 9-year-old who had never once in his life had the luxury of lying in bed. He had the second tin cup in his hand before Elias said anything about it, and he brought it to Clara with careful, slightly formal gravity. The gravity of someone trying to be useful without making a production of being useful. He held the cup out to her at arm's length and waited. She took it from him with both hands and then did the thing Elias watched from the corner of his eye. She didn't ruffle his hair or call him a good helper or say anything that treated him as a prop in a scene she was performing. She just said, "Thank you, Tommy. This is the best thing that's happened to me since yesterday morning," and meant it, and drank. The boy stood a little straighter for the rest of the morning without appearing to notice he was doing it. Elias built the travois from 2 pine poles he cut at the water's edge, straight-grained, dry enough to be light, long enough to clear the roan's hindquarters with room to spare, and lashed them with the rope he kept coiled behind his saddle, the canvas section from the wagon's surviving ribs stretched between them. It would hold her weight if they kept the pace patient. The roan was a patient horse. They suited each other. She lay on it without complaining. He noticed she spent the first hour with her eyes open and her gaze moving, reading the landscape, marking landmarks, cataloguing the route, not panicking, working. Around mid-morning she spoke. "How long have you had him?" She meant Tommy, who was riding 20 yards ahead, practicing the 3-note whistle Elias had been teaching him, their signal for worth noting, repeated 3 times fast, for worth stopping everything. 6 months. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, found him in an abandoned homestead east of the Judith River. His father had died of fever over the winter, no other family that could be located, and you kept him, couldn't leave him there. He said it the way he said most factual things, once, without elaboration, as if the explanation was self-contained. She was quiet for a beat. "No," she said finally, "I don't suppose you could." The morning opened up around them, the trail climbing slightly through short grass and limestone outcroppings, the sky high and pale, the cold steady but not punishing. Tommy occasionally rode in small circles when the trail allowed it, the spotted mare tolerating this with the resigned patience of a horse that had decided it wasn't worth arguing about. Elias had been watching the northwest ridgeline since before they started moving. The riders who'd passed in the dark, he hadn't mentioned them to her yet. She'd heard them herself, he suspected. Her breathing had changed when the hoofbeats were closest, gone shallower and more controlled, the way breathing changed when a person was trying to be very quiet and very still. Around midday, the shot came. One crack from the tree line east of the trail, sharp in the cold air. And his hand was on his rifle, and he was half off his horse before his conscious mind had fully assembled the situation, the rifle at his shoulder, his eyes finding and moving through targets in the same second. A hunter, a man in a brown canvas coat, 70 yards into the cottonwoods, looking back at Elias with the startled expression of someone who'd been shooting at a deer and was surprised to find himself in a different kind of situation. He raised his free hand, palm out. Elias lowered the rifle. He sat there for a moment. His hands were steady. They were always steady. That particular part of him had never failed even when the rest of him was in pieces. But his chest was doing the thing it did, the tight, pressured thing, the thing that happened when a certain kind of sound came without warning and his body answered the wrong year. Tommy had pulled up beside him and was watching with careful, sidelong attention. The look the boy used when he was worried, and had decided not to make it obvious. "He's gone," Elias said, meaning, "We're fine," meaning, "Stand down." "I see that," Clara said from the travois. She'd seen his hands move before his mind caught up. She'd seen the half-second gap between the sound and the thought, the place where something old lived and didn't need instructions. She didn't say anything else about it. And he was aware of exactly how much deliberate restraint that cost her, because she struck him as someone who generally had something to say when she'd observed something worth noting. He pressed the ring through his shirt, exhaled, moved on. They ate at noon without stopping. Dried meat and biscuits from the canvas sack, water from the creek they followed for 3 miles through the middle part of the valley. Tommy caught a small trout in 12 minutes, using a bent pin and a piece of the dried meat as bait, which Clara watched with an expression of genuine curiosity that gradually shifted into something that was almost admiration. "Where did you learn that?" she asked him. "Elias showed me." Tommy held up the fish for her inspection. It was approximately 7 inches long and deeply proud of itself. He says if you watch the water long enough, it tells you where they are. "Does it?" "Takes a while." Tommy looked at the fish. "But yeah." She glanced at Elias. He was watching the ridge. The 4 riders appeared in the mid-afternoon. They came over the south ridge in a line, moving with the purposeful ground-eating pace of animals that had arrived at a destination rather than traveled through one. 4 horses, dun-colored, the matching kind that came from a single outfit's remuda rather than 4 different sources. They were heading east, mostly, but their angle of travel would intersect the trail in less than 2 miles if they maintained direction. Elias moved the horse and the roan into a shallow draw without speaking, pulling the travois in after him, easing through the high grass with the particular unhurried urgency of someone who'd done this before and knew that quick motion attracted eyes faster than slow motion. Tommy followed without a word or a question. The boy had learned. When Elias moved quiet and fast, you moved quiet and fast and sorted out the why of it later. They sat in the draw. The cottonwood stand was thin but sufficient. The grass was tall enough, the bank low enough. The hoofbeats grew and then peaked and then began to recede, heading east, not slowing, not stopping, looking but not finding. The silence after was specific, the kind of silence that had shape. "Friends of yours?" Elias asked. "No," she said. One word, carrying the exact opposite of its weight. He didn't push. Not yet. They made camp that evening in a hollow between two limestone formations. Natural walls on 3 sides, clear sightlines on the 4th, the kind of camp Elias found by instinct now, the part of him that thought in angles and cover, unable to fully disengage. He'd stopped apologizing for it 3 years ago. He was changing the dressing on her left side by firelight, her sitting still, with her teeth set against the discomfort, him working quickly to keep the exposure short, when the cord swung free of his collar. He'd leaned forward to check the binding, and the leather string fell loose, the gold band catching the firelight for a moment before he straightened. She looked at it, not quickly, for a moment. He didn't tuck it back immediately. "There's a ring on that cord," she said, not as an accusation, not prying, just acknowledging what she'd seen. "Yes." She held his gaze for a second, adding this to whatever she'd already assembled, and then looked back at her own hands in her lap. She didn't ask. The question was present in the space she'd left for it, and she was choosing not to fill the space. He let it stand. When he'd finished with the dressing and she'd pulled her shirt back to her shoulder, she said, "I'm not going to be a burden to you. Or a problem. Didn't say you were. You're thinking about it." He began putting the medical supplies back into the tin box, methodical. "I'm thinking about a few things. Such as the 4 riders who were looking and didn't find us." He looked at her, "and the man who works out of the back of the saloon in Harlow's Creek running errands for Gerald Whitmore." He waited. "We'll reach that town tomorrow afternoon. You can tell me what I need to know before we get there, or you can tell me nothing at all. But I'm not riding in blind with you and a 9-year-old. The fire moved between them. She looked at it for a long moment. He watched the thing working in her expression, the calculation, the assessment of a man she'd known less than 24 hours and didn't have enough information about yet, and the careful, methodical way she was deciding how much of the truth she could afford to spend. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll tell you tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once and left her to the fire. He sat with his back against the limestone and his rifle across his knees, watching the dark in the direction those riders had gone. The cold came down hard after midnight, the kind of cold that had intentions. He pulled his coat tighter and didn't sleep. Somewhere in the direction of Cascade Valley, something was still moving that hadn't given up. He planned to be ready for it when it arrived. Morning came in at 32 degrees and stayed there, the sky the color of old pewter, the grass stiff with frost. Elias had been up for 40 minutes when Clara woke. He'd watered the horses, scouted 200 yards in each direction, eaten half a biscuit standing up, and was crouched at the fire heating water when she opened her eyes. By the time he looked up, she was already trying to sit. She got upright in 2 attempts, the first failing when her left side refused to cooperate, the second succeeding through what appeared to be sheer determination, applied at a molecular level. She sat in the frost-white grass, with her arm pressed against her ribs and her jaw set, and looked at the small fire like it had done something to offend her. "There's coffee," he said. "Good." She took the cup he poured and held it in both hands and drank the first swallow with her eyes closed, the way people drank the first swallow of something hot when they were very cold and had been pretending they weren't. "I was trying to start it myself before you got back. I couldn't get the flint. Cracked ribs make everything about 20% harder." 30, she said, "at least." He handed her the remaining biscuit from the night before without comment. She ate it without protest, which told him she'd stopped performing indifference to discomfort and was now in the more pragmatic phase of recovery. He preferred the pragmatic phase. It was easier to work with. Tommy woke up and ate half a dried apple, gave the other half to the spotted mare, and then positioned himself near Clara with the careful, quiet intention of someone who had made a private decision and was executing it. He sat cross-legged in the frost-stiff grass 3 feet from her and looked at her with the direct, unashamed curiosity of a child who had decided she was interesting. "How come you don't have a husband?" he asked. He asked it the way he asked most questions, without preamble, without strategy, with the assumption that the answer existed and ought to be forthcoming. "Tommy." Elias said it without looking up from the cinch strap he was checking. "What? She's going to Whitmore Ranch, but she doesn't seem like she knows anyone there." "I don't," Clara said calmly. She looked at the boy directly, which he appreciated in the way he appreciated most things people did that treated him as a person rather than an inconvenience. "I was traveling to meet the man I was supposed to marry. We'd never met. My father arranged it." Tommy turned this over with visible effort. "Did you want to? Marry someone you never met?" She was quiet for a moment that lasted just long enough to be honest. "I thought I might find out when I arrived." The boy absorbed this with the gravity of someone who'd been told a complicated truth and had decided to respect it. "My pa arranged things too," he said finally. "Mostly they didn't work out." "No," she said, "mostly they don't." The travois held. The roan was patient. They rode out with the frost still on the grass and the pale sun climbing slowly behind them, and the 26 miles to Harlow's Creek felt manageable in a way yesterday hadn't. She talked more that morning, or rather, she let conversation happen the way it happened between people at a temporary truce. Careful, incremental. Neither of them offering more than was asked for, both of them listening to what wasn't being said as much as what was. He told her about finding Tommy, the hollow homestead east of the Judith, the boy sitting on the front step with a blanket around his shoulders and a posture of absolute self-possession that had hit Elias somewhere he didn't have a name for. He'd intended to ride on to the next town and report it to someone with authority over such things. He'd been meaning to do that for 6 months. "You couldn't leave him," she said. "No. He doesn't look like someone who needs rescuing." "He doesn't." Elias watched Tommy riding ahead, practicing the 3-note whistle, getting it right on the 5th attempt, not celebrating. "That's why I stayed." She was quiet for a full mile after that. Then, "That's an unusual reason, is it? Most people stay for the ones who need them. You stayed for the one who would have been fine without you." He didn't answer, but she wasn't wrong, and they both understood that he knew it. Harlow's Creek appeared in the early afternoon, crouching in a shallow valley with the look of a town that had arrived there by accident and was still deciding whether to commit. 14 buildings on the main street, 3 of which were saloons, a general store with a broad porch, a livery at the far end, run by a grey man who had the particular efficiency of someone who'd seen everything and retained opinions about none of it, and a 2-story wooden structure that served as inn and meeting hall and whatever else needed a roof for the night. 35 cents a person, cash, no accounts. Elias paid the livery boy 40 cents for water and a stall, helped Clara to her feet with his hands under her arms, and lifted most of the weight off her ribs without making it a production. She stood on her own the moment she was upright, a second, no more, to stabilize, and then she was standing on her own power, and her face said clearly that this was how it was going to be. He noted it. He didn't say anything about it. The general store smelled like beeswax and sawdust and dried beans and leather, the same smell in every territory he'd ever passed through, as reliable as weather. The man behind the counter was barrel-chested and businesslike, with the careful blank expression of someone who'd learned that curiosity was expensive. There were 2 other men in the store, ranchers from the look of them, broad-shouldered, work-worn, deep in a conversation at the far end of the counter that they barely paused for the arrival of new customers. "Still putting it out," one of them was saying, his back to the door. $200 for a woman from Boston. Says she got separated from her party in some kind of outlaw trouble out east of the valley. Generous, the second one said, in the tone that meant the opposite. Generous when it's something he considers his, I suppose. Clara had stopped moving. It was small, barely visible to anyone who hadn't spent 2 days watching her. Her right hand was resting on a bolt of calico at the dry goods shelf, and it had stopped moving, and her back was to the 2 ranchers, and she was looking at the fabric with the fixed attention of a woman reading a very complicated message in the weave. Elias was 3 feet away. He looked at her. She looked at the calico. "My wife's looking for some trim," he said to the man behind the counter, casually, without a pause, the way a person said something they'd been thinking about saying. He stepped to Clara's side and placed his hand briefly against the small of her back, the lightest possible contact, a statement rather than a grip. Something serviceable, dark color. The ranchers barely glanced at them. The storekeeper pointed at a shelf near the window. Elias moved to the shelf with Clara and kept his voice below the noise of the other men's conversation. "Get a room. I'll be there in 5 minutes." She didn't nod, but she moved. The inn charged 35 cents a night per person. Elias paid without negotiating, requested a ground-floor room without explaining why, and went back for Tommy, who was standing on the porch examining something in the rain barrel with the focused scientific interest of a 9-year-old who had never been told not to. He closed the door of the room behind them. The room was small. Iron bed, 1 chair, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and smelled like the particular combination of old wood and lye soap that every cheap room in every cheap inn smelled like. It was sufficient. Elias stood with his back to the door. "Tell me," he said. She sat on the edge of the iron bed and looked at her hands for a moment. Those hands, less soft than 2 days ago, the palms marked now with new pressure lines from bracing herself on the travois, were folded in her lap with the careful composure of someone organizing their thoughts before they committed to words. "My name is Clara Harrington," she said. "My father is Edward Harrington." I found the envelope," he said, "in the case." She absorbed this without changing expression. A small pause, and then, "You didn't open it?" "No." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't mine to open." Something shifted very slightly in her face, a door opening a 1/4 inch. She looked at the floor, then back up. "My father arranged the marriage," she said. "Gerald Whitmore needs capital. He's extended himself badly across 3 counties, and the bank in Helena is losing patience. My father wants a foothold in the territory. A rail junction in Cascade County would be worth more than anything else Whitmore could offer." She said it with the flat precision of someone recounting a business transaction, because that was exactly what it was. "I agreed because my father asked me to, and because—" A pause, the first one that wasn't about organization. "Because I thought it might be different out here, that in a place with no history of me, I might be something other than an asset in a dress." The room was quiet except for Tommy, who had found something small and orange under the bed and was examining it with great interest. "The men who died," Elias said. "My father's hired men, paid to see me safely to Cascade County." Her voice didn't break, but her hands, in her lap, closed slowly into fists. "A man named Robert Fitch had 3 daughters. The youngest was 4 years old. He showed me her photograph the first morning out of Billings. She had red hair." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "He showed me because he was proud, because she was the best thing in his life, and he wanted someone to know it." Elias looked at the floor between them. "Whitmore sent those men," she said. "I don't know what changed, but those were his horses heading east, and I intend to—" She stopped again, something harder than grief working in her face. "I don't have a plan. I have a name and a direction and about $14 in my coat pocket. That is where I am." He reached into his collar and pulled the cord out for the second time, but this time he drew the ring free and let it hang in the afternoon light from the window, the gold band turning slowly on its leather string, worn smooth in the way things worn smooth by grief didn't look like other things. "Her name was Mary," he said. He looked at it for a moment. 3 years this November." He looked up. "I had a daughter too. She was 2 years old. Her name was Grace." He put the ring back against his chest. "Some things you don't say out loud very often," he said, "because saying them out loud doesn't make them more true, it just makes them more present." The silence that followed had the specific weight of two people who have recognized something in each other and are not yet certain what to do about the recognition. The fire in the small iron stove ticked. Outside, the street sounds of Harlow's Creek came through the thin walls. Horses, voices, someone's door. "I found a cat," Tommy announced. He was holding it up for inspection. A small orange barn cat of indeterminate age and considerable self-possession, which was tolerating the situation with the resigned dignity of a creature that had seen worse. He presented it to the room with the formal gravity of someone offering relevant evidence. Clara looked at the cat. The cat looked at Clara with the flat amber assessment of something that had no complicated interior life and was content about it. Something happened in her face, a release, small and involuntary, the careful composure cracking for just a moment, turning into something that was almost a laugh before it caught itself halfway through. Almost. But almost was enough to see what lived underneath the composure, and what lived there was warmer than he'd expected. "Of course there's a cat," she said. Elias looked at her face in that unguarded half-second and looked away before she caught him doing it. Tommy sat down on the floor with the cat in his lap and looked between the two of them with the frank, unashamed assessment of a 9-year-old who had been watching adults for evidence of sense for most of his life and was cautiously optimistic. "There's one more thing," Clara said. The almost laugh was gone. She was back to the measured, careful person who weighed what she spent before she spent it, but something in her posture had shifted. The door that had opened a 1/4 inch was a little wider now. "I told you my father has money. That's not—" She stopped. "The Northern Pacific's Eastern Branch. He owns the controlling share. He owns 47,000 acres across 4 states and 2 banks, and has more business in Washington than in any office with his name on the door." She said it without vanity, which made it land harder than vanity would have. "I have enough money to buy Gerald Whitmore's ranch, his debts, and everything attached to his name, and still have sufficient remaining to do it twice more." She looked at him directly, without the careful sideways quality her gaze usually had. "I told no one I was traveling as a Harrington. I told the escorts because they had to know who to protect. But everyone else, I wanted to see what a person looked like when they looked at me without knowing the number. Just once. I wanted to know if it was different." He sat with that for a moment. "And what do you want now?" he asked of Clara Harrington. She opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at Tommy, who was scratching the orange cat under its chin with absolute concentration, and at the small iron stove, and at her own hands in her lap, and then back at him. "I'm not sure anymore," she said quietly. "That's the most honest thing I've said in 6 months." He was about to say something. He wasn't certain what, some response that was either too much or too little, he hadn't decided, when Tommy's head came up. The boy had better hearing than anyone Elias had ridden with. He had proven it so many times in 6 months that Elias had stopped being surprised by it. He proved it again now. His body went still a full second before the sound resolved itself into something Elias's own ears could parse. Horses. Outside, on the main street, pulling up with the heavy, deliberate weight of animals that had arrived at a destination rather than passed through one. 4 of them, maybe 5. They stopped in front of the inn. The horses stopped directly in front of the inn. Elias was at the window in 4 steps, keeping to the wall, checking the angle, looking without putting his face in the glass. 5 horses, not 4. 5, in the fading afternoon light of Harlow's Creek's one main street, ridden by men who wore the careful, particular blankness of people employed to be present and say nothing until told otherwise. One of them was not blank. He was, perhaps 50, heavy-set in the way that wasn't fat. It was density, the weight of a man who had eaten well for a long time and moved slowly because he had never been required to move any other way. He wore a brown canvas coat with a sheepskin collar, a hat that had cost more than everything else on his body combined, and the expression of a man who had never arrived anywhere and found it not to his satisfaction. Gerald Whitmore. Elias didn't know for certain, but he knew the type. He'd seen it before in the particular architecture of men who owned things, ranches, mines, politicians, arrangements, and understood ownership to be a naturally occurring force like weather. "Back of the bed," he said. "Both of you. Tommy, the cat goes." Tommy set the cat down, and the cat walked unhurriedly toward the washstand and sat under it, demonstrating a tactical common sense that Elias respected. Clara was already on her feet. Her face had gone to the careful, still quality it carried when she was managing something, composure as active work, not passive condition. "Is it him?" she asked. Thick man with money in his coat, brown sheepskin collar. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. "Yes. Does he know your face?" "We've never met." She paused. "He'll have been sent a photograph." "How recent?" 18 months. He looked at her. The torn dress, the dried blood at her jawline, the road 2 days had put on her. "You don't look much like a photograph right now," he said, which was factual rather than comforting. She sat in the single chair with her back to the door, facing the wall, her spine straight. "Go!" he went. The man was already in the front room of the inn when Elias came down the stairs, standing at the counter with his hat in his hand and his chin at the angle of someone who expected things to be easy. The innkeeper was behind the counter, doing the careful non-expression of a man who charged 35 cents a night and had no interest in anything that cost more than that. "Any woman come in today," Whitmore was saying. He had a voice that arrived before the rest of him did, smooth and considered, the voice of a man who'd spent years being listened to and had come to mistake that for being right. Boston woman, traveling with a party out of Billings. "Sir," the innkeeper spread both hands on the counter, "I run a quiet establishment. $200 for the right answer." The innkeeper's face did not change, which meant he was doing his own math and had arrived somewhere Whitmore wasn't going to like. Elias came off the last stair and into the room at the ordinary pace of a man coming down for supper, and he nodded at the innkeeper and looked briefly at Whitmore with exactly the amount of interest a man gave to strangers in a public room, which was not much. "Evening," he said to neither of them specifically. "You." Whitmore turned to him with the easy authority of a man who had never had a stranger decline to be useful. "You been on the trail today?" "Most of it." "Come across a woman?" "Boston type. Traveling party. Escorts, trunks, wagon?" Elias thought about it in the measured way of a man who was actually trying to be helpful. "Saw some wagon tracks east of the valley this morning, going northeast." He scratched his jaw. "Nothing moving on them, though." "East of the valley." Whitmore repeated it, turning it over. His eyes were moving over Elias in the professional way of a man who bought and sold information and had learned to read the people carrying it. Small eyes. "Patient? You alone on the trail?" "My boy and I." He let a pause fall, naturally. "Wife's got the sniffles. Staying in tonight." Whitmore looked at him for 2 more seconds. Elias looked back the way he looked at everything, level, without urgency. The way his father had looked at difficult horses, without making the energy available that difficulty needed to grow. "Much obliged," Whitmore said, and turned back to the counter. Elias went to the kitchen end of the front room, spoke briefly to the woman there about supper, and went back upstairs at the same unhurried pace. He locked the door behind him. Clara was still in the chair. She had not moved. Her posture had the specific quality of stillness that costs something to maintain, the stillness of a body that wants to be in motion and is choosing not to be. When he came through the door and turned the key, she exhaled through her nose in a slow, controlled way that let some of the tension go without performing it. "He'll ride out tonight," Elias said, "checking the tracks I gave him. That buys us until morning, maybe more." She nodded. "Clara." He waited until she looked at him. "He sent those men, the ones who killed Robert Fitch and the others." "I know. Flat, final." The way she said things when she had already survived knowing them and had nothing more to do with the fact of it. "You said you had no plan." I said I had a name and $14 and a direction. I also said that was honest. She looked at her hands in her lap. I have more now. I have... She stopped. I have resources. In Boston, attorneys. But Boston is not here. No, it's not. So, she looked up at him. What do you do when the thing you need is 1,000 miles away and the problem is standing on the street below you? He thought about it seriously, the way she delivered the question. You work with what you have. What do we have? A horse, a roan, a spotted mare, a 9-year-old with good instincts, and a ranch hand I know in Bozeman who owes me a thing that is larger than a favor. He paused. And a telegraph office 2 buildings down from the livery. Her eyes moved to his face. How early does it open? 5:30. Sunup. Doodle. My father's business address is 14 Federal Street, Boston. His telegraph operator is a man named Coates, who works the first shift and knows my name. She said it precisely, quickly, assembling the plan the way she assembled everything, without wasted motion. One message, 30 words, will put more law into Cascade County than Whitmore has ever faced in his life. And in the meantime, she said, we don't use the front door. The corner of his mouth moved. Not much, but she caught it, and something in her face caught it back. The first unguarded exchange between them, neither performing for the other, something simply passing between 2 people who'd recognized they were operating in the same direction. Tommy was sitting on the floor with his back to the iron bed, the cat back in his lap, despite the orange creature's earlier escape attempt. He was watching the 2 of them with the patient, measuring attention of a child, cataloguing the world. Are we leaving tonight? He asked. Before dawn, Elias said. Okay. Tommy nodded, satisfied. He looked at Clara. You should eat something. Elias is bad at saying that, but it's what he means when he goes to talk to the kitchen lady. Clara looked at the boy and then back at Elias. Is that what you meant? There's beef stew, he said. She ate. They left at 4:30 in the morning, the town still dark, the temperature down to 23 degrees, the kind of cold that arrived with a specific intention and stayed until it had made its point. Elias went to the telegraph office at 5:15 and waited on the porch for the light to come on inside. And when it did, he went in and sent 31 words to a man named Coates at 14 Federal Street, Boston, from a woman named Clara, who was safe and needed her father's particular kind of attention directed toward a man named Whitmore in Cascade County. He paid 60 cents. He was back on his horse by 5:40, Clara already on the travois, Tommy already up on the spotted mare with the alert, forward-facing posture of someone who'd been up for an hour and was fully present for whatever happened next. They rode northwest. The morning they rode through was cold and clear, the October sky above the ridgeline turning from steel to copper to a pale gold that lit the frost on the grass without warming it. Somewhere to the southeast, Gerald Whitmore was following tracks that led nowhere useful. Elias was aware of this the way he was aware of a gap in the tree line, as a fact with a short expiration date, not as relief. They covered 16 miles before noon. The trouble came at the river crossing. It was shallow this time of year, knee-deep on the horses, barely moving, the bank cut low and easy on both sides, the kind of crossing that should take 5 minutes. But the roan stopped at the bank, planted, ears back, head low, the particular refusal of a horse that is afraid and has decided to make it categorical. Elias knew what it meant before he saw it. The cotton would stand on the opposite bank, the stillness that wasn't natural stillness. The way 2 branches on the left side were wrong, too still in a wind that was moving everything else. Easy, he said, to the roan, or to Clara, or to all of them. He sat his horse and looked at the bank across the water for 12 seconds. I count 2, Clara said quietly from the travois. She'd been watching the trees. 3, he kept his voice flat. Left side, center, and back in the shadows. Men from the store. Likely. The crossing was the only direct route northwest for 6 miles in either direction. Going around meant half a day on rough ground, her ribs, no cover, and whoever was in those trees knew it. He looked at the water. looked at the bank. "Tommy," he kept his voice even. "You remember what I told you about the river in August?" The boy looked at him, thought. "Keep to the right of the big rock." "Keep to the right of the big rock," Elias confirmed. "Water's fastest there. Horses don't like the bottom." He paused. "Go left, hard left of the rock. Cross. Keep the mare moving. Don't stop on the other bank." Tommy understood. He always understood. His eyes went to the trees and came back to Elias, and he nodded once, a single clean nod that belonged to someone 3 times his age. Clara. He reached under his coat and produced the small revolver from his belt, the backup piece, a 4-inch Colt. "You know how to use this." It wasn't a question. She took it without hesitation, held it properly, checked it with the practiced motion of someone who'd been taught and hadn't forgotten. "My father insisted," she said, and there was a dry, dark edge in it that wasn't quite humor, but lived in the same neighborhood. "He gave a signal that looked like nothing, barely a shift in weight, and his horse entered the water. What happened next took 45 seconds. He would reconstruct it later in the way he reconstructed the things that mattered. In order, without sentiment, looking for what he could have done better and what he would do the same. First movement from the trees came when he was 10 yards into the crossing, a man standing up from the cottonwood roots, rifle coming up, and Elias's horse was already driving right before the rifle leveled, already changing the angle, already making the geometry wrong. He drew and fired once, and the rifle dropped and the man dropped with it. Second movement. A man on horseback bursting from the center of the stand, good rider, experienced, cutting toward the bank at an angle to intercept the travois before it reached the water. Clara tracked him with the Colt for 3 seconds that seemed to happen at a different speed than the rest of time. And when she fired, he was 20 feet out. She hit what she aimed at. Third man was the one in the shadows, and he was the one Elias had been most worried about since he'd spotted him. The one who stayed back and watched and waited to see how it unfolded before he moved. Smart. More dangerous than the others, not less. He came out of the cottonwood stand as Elias reached the far bank, moving north at a hard run on a good horse, and he did not look back. Running. Elias didn't pursue. He sat his horse on the far bank and watched the rider diminish into the dry grass to the north, and then he pulled his eyes back across the water to where Tommy was already moving the spotted mare toward him, having crossed 20 yards downstream at the hard left angle, exactly as instructed, keeping the mare's hooves in the shallower water. Never once stopping, the boy reached the bank and brought the mare alongside and looked at Elias and did not say anything about what had just happened. He looked at Clara on the travois. She was sitting up, had pulled herself to a sitting position during the crossing, ribs be damned, with the empty Colt in her hand, and an expression that had come down from a very high place and was still landing. 2 shots, Elias said. 2 shots, she confirmed. Clean? She looked at the second man, who was not getting up. Yes. Tommy looked between them. Is it over? He asked. For today, Elias said. He reached across and took the Colt from her and reloaded it without speaking. Her hands, when she let go of it, were steady. He noticed this specifically. In his experience, the people whose hands were steady after something like that were either very experienced or very determined, and Clara Harrington was not experienced. He gave the Colt back to her. She took it. They rode for 4 more hours without stopping. They reached the Dawson homestead, a working cattle spread 12 miles north of the river, near sundown, and the man who came out to meet them from the porch was the ranch hand Elias had mentioned, whose name was Pete Dawson, and who owed a thing larger than a favor, and knew it. He was 63, broad, with the particular worn leather quality of a man who'd spent 4 decades outside and had come to an agreement with the weather about it. He looked at Elias, looked at Clara on the travois, looked at Tommy. How bad? He said. Ribs. Gash is healing. She needs a real bed and 48 hours. Come inside. Udictum. The house was warm. It smelled like wood smoke and old coffee, and the particular smell of habitation, the smell of people living in a place rather than passing through it. A woman named Frances, Pete's wife of 32 years, who had the face of someone who had seen everything and had achieved a permanent state of pragmatic competence about it, met them in the front room and took one look at Clara and had her in the back bedroom with a change of clothes and hot water before Elias had finished unsaddling the horses. Tommy fell asleep at the kitchen table over a bowl of soup. Elias put him in the chair by the wood stove with a blanket and left him there. He sat at the table with Pete and 2 cups of something that was technically coffee, and he explained the situation in the economical terms Pete would understand and not embellish. Whitmore, the attack on the wagon party, the men at the crossing, the telegraph to Boston, the third rider who was still out there, still moving, who had seen both of them and would be able to describe both of them accurately. Pete listened, drank, thought. Whitmore's been reaching for more than he can hold for 3 years, he said. Land, rail contracts, the county commissioner's ear. A man like that doesn't stop. He just gets more careful. He got careless, Elias said. Those men at the crossing weren't subtle. Desperate people aren't subtle. Pete looked at his cup. And a man losing money is desperate underneath, no matter what his coat costs. He paused. The woman's Harrington's daughter. Yes. That's a weight he may not understand, he picked up. No. Elias looked at the table. He doesn't understand that yet. In the morning he went to the barn before anyone was awake. He had a habit of this, of being in places where a man could be alone with the practical work of his hands, the horses receiving attention they needed and not asking for anything else in return. He was cleaning the roan's near hind hoof when he heard the barn door. Clara came in with a cup of coffee in each hand, wearing a borrowed flannel shirt over her dress and moving with more ease than she had in 4 days, which meant she was finally listening to her ribs about the pace. She held 1 cup out to him. He took it. She leaned against the stall post and looked at the roan, who looked back with the equable patience of a horse that had no strong opinions about new arrivals. "Better?" he asked. "Considerably." She drank. "Francis has the firm opinion that I should remain in bed for another 3 days. She expressed this opinion 4 times before breakfast. Francis is usually right. She's entirely right. I'm going to stay. She said it as a decision, not a concession. But I need to tell you something first." He put down the hoofpick and waited. She was looking at the roan. "My father will come," she said, "when he gets the telegraph. He will arrive with attorneys and whatever portion of the Northern Pacific's private affairs he considers portable, and he will turn Gerald Whitmore into a lesson for anyone else who considers doing the same thing." She paused. "And then he will come here, and he will see." She stopped, looked at her coffee cup. "He'll see a cowboy and a 9-year-old boy," Elias said. "He'll see a man he'll want to understand," she corrected quietly. "And he'll ask the questions he asks about men he wants to understand. And some of those questions will be about what you intend. Do you want to know what I intend?" She looked at him, directly. The door that had been opening incrementally since the first night in the grass was open all the way now, and what was behind it was careful and specific, and did not intend to be made a fool of. "Yes," she said. He held the cup in both hands and looked at the roan. The barn was full of the ordinary morning sounds, rustling, the easy movement of horses, wind in the boards. Outside, a crow was making noise about something it had found in the frost. "I've been moving since she died," he said. "Mary, I've been moving because being in one place—" He stopped, started differently. "The ring's been on that cord for 3 years. I wore it on my hand for 4 years before that." He looked at the ring where it hung against his chest. "I kept it there because taking it off meant something I wasn't—" Another stop. He wasn't good at this. He was aware of not being good at it the way he was aware of most of his deficiencies. Clearly, without self-pity, with the general intention of doing better. Tommy changed it, having him around. Something about him needing a present person instead of a— He made a slight gesture that meant the thing I was. "A man walking in his own past," she said softly. He looked at her. "I've done it too," she said. "Not grief, different, but the same mechanism." She turned her cup slowly in her hands. "Wearing the role your loss wrote for you, becoming convenient for other people's needs, forgetting you have a preference. He held her gaze. "What's your preference, Clara?" She was quiet for a moment that had weight. "To be seen," she said. "Not the name, not the railroad shares, not the asset in the dress." She looked up. "Just this, what's right here. I would like someone to know that this is what's real, and to—" She stopped. "I've been in front of you for 4 days, at my absolute worst, and you—" She stopped again, and then, with more directness than most people he'd ever encountered, "I think you already know I'm real, and I think you've been trying not to do anything about it." He looked at the roan for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying to give you room." "You've given me considerable room," she said. "Too much?" She looked at him. The silence lasted 3 seconds, which was enough. He set his cup down. He crossed the 4 feet between them and stopped close enough that the morning breath of the barn was between them and nothing else. And he looked at her, just looked at her, without the careful, sidelong quality he'd been practicing, and put his right hand against the side of her face with the same deliberateness he put into everything that mattered. She was very still. He said, "I've known you 4 days. I'm aware. I have a 9-year-old. I've noticed. I own 1 horse, a roan, $17, and a coat with a hole in the left elbow. I know. I don't know what I intend except that I—" He stopped. He said it the way he'd learned to say the things that were true and large, and didn't fit inside the words he had, directly, without preparation, without performance. "I don't want you to go to Boston and become a name in a newspaper I won't ever read. I want—" The pause was not hesitation. It was him selecting the exact word and not spending a lesser one. "More." Her hand came up and covered his where it rested against her jaw. "More," she repeated, as if testing its weight. "That's all I have," he said. "Elias." She said his name the way people said things they'd been holding for a while, measured and deliberate. "That is considerably more than anyone has ever offered me." He might have said something else. He wasn't certain what. But before he could, they heard Tommy's boot heels on the path from the house, the specific, slightly too fast rhythm of a 9-year-old who had news and was carrying it at speed. And then the barn door opened, and the boy was inside, slightly out of breath, with the direct and urgent expression that meant something had happened. "A man came," Tommy said, "on a good horse. He wants Elias." Elias stepped back. His hand found the cord against his chest for 1 second. Old motion, present motion, both true at once. "What kind of man?" "The kind," Tommy said, "with a badge." The deputy's name was Calloway. 26, wire thin, with the raw-nerved alertness of someone who'd recently arrived at a situation bigger than his job description and was working very hard to pretend otherwise. He stood in Pete Dawson's front yard, with his hands visible and his horse tied at the post, and the look of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say and was now uncertain whether to say it. "I tracked you from the river crossing," he told Elias. "The 2 men. There are questions." "I'd expect so." "The woman?" He looked toward the house. "She's here. She's here. She's injured." Calloway held Elias's gaze. Then he said, with the specific intonation of someone sharing information rather than making accusations, "Gerald Whitmore filed a claim this morning with the county office. Says his property was stolen. Says there was an incident at the river crossing that he wants investigated." He paused. "Says the woman traveling in the wagon party was under his legal protection per a contract of marriage." Elias looked at him. "He says," Calloway continued more quietly, "that she belongs to him." The word fell into the yard and lay there. "She belongs to herself," Elias said, level, final. "She's here because she was the sole survivor of an attack on a 4-person traveling party, and she required medical attention. The incident at the crossing was self-defense against armed men. I'll state that under oath to anyone who wants to hear it." Calloway looked at him. Long, careful look, the look of a young man trying to determine who was actually telling the truth and what it would cost him to act on the determination. "She'll need to speak for herself," he said finally. "In town. Formally." "I know." Elias held the deputy's eye. "When?" Tomorrow morning, county office. He paused. Whitmore will be there. Good. Calloway blinked at that. He hadn't expected good. Elias looked at him steadily. Tell the county office that Miss Clara Eliza Harrington, the daughter of Edward Harrington of 14 Federal Street, Boston, will provide her account of events tomorrow morning. Write it down exactly that way. He watched the name land on Calloway. Watched the deputy's face make the calculation, work out the weight of what he'd just been told, and arrive somewhere very different from where he'd started. Harrington, Calloway said. Write it down. The young man wrote it down. He was back on his horse and down the road before noon, moving with more urgency than he'd arrived with. Pete came out to stand beside Elias after the sound of hooves had faded. Tomorrow, Pete said. Tomorrow, in front of Whitmore. Yes. Pete looked at the road. You're going to stand up in front of a man with 20 years of Cascade County in his pocket and call him responsible for 4 deaths. Someone is, Elias said. You could lose. Pete said it without softness and without cruelty, the way a man said the truth to someone who had earned a straight answer. Yes. Elias pressed the ring once through his shirt. I've lost before. Silence. She going to be there? Pete asked. It's her fight, Elias said. I'm not doing it for her. I'm standing next to her while she does it. Pete looked at him for a moment, nodded once. Then you'd better eat something. He said it the way Tommy said things, simply, practically, with the understanding that what came next required fuel. The afternoon went long and quiet. Francis changed Clara's dressing and declared the ribs making progress and produced an apple pie from somewhere that Tommy ate approximately 40% of before anyone could stop him and expressed no remorse about. The table that evening had the specific warmth of a temporary thing that was complete in itself. 5 people who had no permanent claim on each other, passing food and not saying very much and not needing to. That night, Elias sat on the porch steps in the cold and held the ring in his palm, not against his chest, in his palm, open. He looked at it in the low light from the window for a long time. The door opened behind him. He didn't close his hand. Clara sat beside him on the step, near enough that the cold between them diminished by a few degrees. She looked at the ring. He looked at the ring. Tomorrow is going to be difficult, she said. Yes. Whitmore will have the county commissioner. He'll have 3 or 4 men whose version of events has been coordinated and is already agreed upon. She said it without self-pity, cataloguing. He has had 20 years to make this county convenient for himself. I know. She looked at the ring in his palm. What was she like? Mary? Ooh, he was quiet for a moment. Then, she laughed at things I didn't expect to be funny. She made good bread. She was stubborn about the wrong thing sometimes and right about almost everything important. He closed his fingers gently around the ring. She would have liked you. She liked people who didn't perform. She sounds... Clara stopped. She sounds like someone who would have been worth knowing. She was. The stars were out above the ranch. The same excessive Montana sky, enormous and indifferent and specific all at once. The cold was the winter announcing itself from a distance. The real cold still weeks away, but visible on the horizon. You're going to put it down soon, she said. Not a question, not pressure. An observation from someone who'd been watching carefully. He looked at the ring in his hand. Not tonight, he said. But, he paused. Closer. She didn't say anything. Just sat with him in the cold for a while, and the not saying anything was exactly the right thing, and he was aware of being in the company of someone who knew when the right thing was nothing. After a while he said, Tomorrow, whatever happens. Elias, she said it quietly, stopping him. I know. She looked at the stars. I know. He put the ring back on its cord, against his chest, where it had lived for 3 years. Then he sat on the step in the October cold and watched the sky with the woman beside him and the boy asleep inside and the horses in the barn and the warm light of the window behind them, and he thought about the word he'd used that morning. More. It had been the smallest and the truest thing he'd said in a long time. He let it stand. The county office in Harlow's Creek opened at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 7:50 there were 11 people waiting outside it. Gerald Whitmore and three men whose relationship to him was immediately legible stood on the left side of the porch steps. Two local ranchers, curious, quiet, neutral in the careful way of people who had not yet decided what being neutral was going to cost them, stood to the right. The deputy Calloway stood near the door, which was either symbolic or structural, and had the expression of a young man who'd been awake most of the night. Elias brought Clara through the center. She walked on her own. He was beside her, and Tommy was on her left, and they came up the main street of Harlow's Creek at an unhurried pace in the cold October morning, with the frost still on the boards of the walk and the breath of all three of them visible in the air. She wore Francis Dawson's best coat, a good wool coat, dark brown, with brass buttons. Her head was up. Whitmore looked at her. She looked back at him, steadily, without challenge or performance, the look of a woman who had already decided what she was and was done renegotiating it with other people. Clara. His voice had the particular quality of a man restoring a first-name intimacy that had never existed. "You look. I was worried. When I heard about the attack—" "You organized the attack," she said. She said it in the same tone she would have said the weather, in the same tone she'd told him her name 4 days ago, once, clearly without preparation or emphasis, as if repetition would be a waste of both their time. One of the ranchers on the right side of the porch made a small sound that was not a cough. "That's a serious—" Whitmore began. Robert Fitch had 3 daughters. Her voice carried without effort in the cold morning air, not raised, not performed, just placed in the silence the way a stone was placed, squarely, with no ambiguity about where it came to rest. She looked at Whitmore directly. The youngest was 4 years old. Her name was Emma. He showed me her photograph on the first morning out of Billings, because she was the best thing in his life, and he wanted someone to know it. A pause. He is dead. His daughters have no father. The other 2 men who died were named Carr and Albrecht. I knew them for 2 days, which was long enough to know that they were decent men who died doing their jobs. Another pause, shorter. You will spend the rest of your life hearing those names. That is not a threat. That is simply what happens. The porch was entirely silent. Whitmore's face had gone to the careful blankness of a man working very hard to calculate. You have no proof. My father does. She reached into the pocket of Francis's coat and drew out a single folded page. This arrived this morning by telegraph, relayed through the Bozeman office. She unfolded it. My father's attorney, a Mr. Lionel Cross, arrived in Helena yesterday evening by private rail car. He has in his possession sworn affidavits from 2 of Whitmore's own ranch hands who were offered terms in exchange for account of their involvement. She looked up from the page. My father is thorough. He has always been thorough. I did not inherit the same management style, but I inherited his thoroughness. She folded the page and returned it to her pocket. I want no part of this county, she said. I want no part of any arrangement that involves your name, your land, or your debts. I'm releasing any claim arising from the intended marriage contract. My attorneys will confirm this formally, and I am requesting that the county record show that I arrived here under duress, and am leaving of my own free will. She looked at Calloway. Deputy, is there anything else you require from me formally? Calloway opened his mouth and closed it. Then, no, ma'am. I think, no, thank you. She looked at Whitmore one final time. Emma Fitch is 4 years old, she said. She'll be 4 years old for 8 more months. After that she'll be 5, and the years will continue, and you will be in all of them. I hope that is as heavy as it deserves to be. She turned from him and walked back down the porch steps. Elias was waiting at the bottom. He'd been standing there since they arrived, not in front of her, not between her and Whitmore, not arranging a position that was about him. Beside her, at her shoulder, in the precise configuration of someone present as a witness rather than a shield. She reached the bottom step and looked at him for a moment. He said nothing. He reached out and put his hand briefly against the back of her wrist. The same deliberateness as the barn, but here, in the open, in the frost-bright morning air of Harlow's Creek, with 11 people watching and a man at the top of the steps whose life had just changed in the direction it deserved to go. She turned her wrist and let her fingers rest over the back of his hand for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Then Tommy said from behind her left elbow, "Can we get breakfast now?" The rancher on the right side of the porch made the sound again. This time it was unambiguously a laugh. They got breakfast. Frances Dawson had come into town behind them in the buckboard, as pragmatic in her support as in everything else, arriving with a basket that contained coffee, sourdough, and a quantity of opinions about Whitmore that she expressed thoroughly and at a comfortable volume, while Pete stood beside her nodding with the contentment of a man whose wife was right and knew it. The 2 ranchers who'd been on the right side of the porch came in after a while and sat at the other end of the table and didn't introduce themselves, but ate with the thoughtful quality of people who'd been in a county a long time and had just watched something shake loose that had needed shaking loose for years. One of them caught Elias's eye at one point and nodded once. The nod meant, "I see it." Elias nodded back. Tommy ate 3 biscuits and was not embarrassed. It was after breakfast, in the quiet of the mid-morning, when the others had moved off, and the 3 of them were alone at the table with the last of the coffee. Clara sitting across from Elias, with her elbows on the table, in a posture that Francis would have objected to, and that he thought suited her enormously, when she said, "My father will arrive within the week. I know. He will be," she considered the word carefully, "grateful to you, in the specific way that men like my father are grateful to men who've done things they feel they should have done themselves. I don't want his gratitude. I know you don't." She looked at her coffee cup. "That's why he'll respect you. He cannot purchase respect, and he knows it. It's the thing he still wants and can't fully get." She looked up. "He will also have questions about your intentions." "I said this before. I meant it." "Say it again," she said quietly. "For me, not for him." He held her gaze. Tommy had tactically relocated to the window seat with the orange cat, which had reappeared from somewhere and was demonstrating the particular diplomacy of a child who understands when adults require space. Elias reached inside his collar. He drew the cord out and unlooped it from behind his neck and held it for a moment, the weight of 3 years of it, every morning's first motion, every difficult moment's reflex. He held it open in his palm. Then he set it on the table between them, not across from her, between them, in the space that belonged to both of them equally. "I don't know what the next year looks like," he said. "I don't know what your father is going to say, or what you're going to decide about Boston, or what happens when the practical things arrive." He looked at the ring on its cord. "But I know what I want to move toward. I want to move toward." The word again. This. A pause. "You and Tommy and the shape of a life that isn't—" He stopped. "That isn't looking backward." She looked at the ring. She reached out and put 2 fingers against it, not picking it up, not moving it, just touching it lightly, the way you touch something that carried weight, and you wanted to acknowledge the weight. "When you're ready," she said, "it should go back on your hand. When I'm ready. I'm not a patient woman," she said, "but I can be." He looked at her face, the jaw with the decision in it, the eyes that were adding and weighing and concluding even now, even in this. The thing behind them that was warm when it was seen and had been unseen for longer than it deserved. "A month," he said. She looked at him. "A month, maybe 2. I'll allow 2, she said. And something that was not quite a smile, but was the same country as a smile, crossed her face and crossed his. And in the window seat, Tommy observed this development with the satisfaction of someone whose private assessment had been confirmed. He reached down and scratched the cat behind its ear. "I knew it," he said, to no one in particular. They left Harlow's Creek 3 days later. Clara on a real horse now, the ribs cooperating at a walk, the travois behind the roan as backup that nobody intended to need. The morning was clear and cold, the frost thick on the grass, the October sky that indifferent blue that was different from summer's blue, more serious, carrying the announcement of what was coming. 2 miles outside of town, on the rise that opened to the valley, Elias turned the horse to face southeast. He'd asked Francis which direction, and Francis had told him, and he'd written it down on a scrap of paper from the back of the ledger Pete kept in the front room. Robert Fitch's family address, Billings, Montana, 2 streets from the stockyard. A 4-year-old girl with red hair named Emma, and 2 older sisters, and a mother who had a husband for 2 days less than she should have. He didn't have what they'd lost, but he had the man's name, and he had the account of what the man had done and who he'd been, and he had the specific small photograph, retrieved from the ruined wagon before they'd left that first camp, folded carefully inside the medicine tin, carried 4 days in his coat pocket, of a little girl with red hair who looked exactly like someone who'd had a good father and knew it. He would bring it himself. Clara was beside him. She looked at the southeast road and back at him. "Go," she said. "We'll be at the Dawsons when you come back." 2 days, he said. "I know." He looked at Tommy. The boy looked back with the direct, patient gaze of someone who understood what was happening and had decided to be unambiguous about his position on it. "I'll take care of them," Tommy said. "I know you will." Elias held the boy's gaze for a moment. This 9-year-old who had been managing himself on a cold porch for a whole winter before Elias arrived, and had simply accepted, without ceremony, that there was now a different arrangement. He held the gaze and let it say what it said, which was more than either of them would have been able to put words to. Then he turned southeast. He pressed the ring, which was no longer on its cord, which was in his coat pocket now, folded in the same paper as Emma Fitch's photograph, where it would stay until he was ready and not 1 day longer, and rode. Behind him, he heard Tommy say to Clara, "He'll be back in 2 days." "I know," she said. "He said 2 days, so it'll be 2 days." A pause. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." The warmth in her voice carried even at distance, even in the cold. "No," she said. "I don't think he does." The road unrolled ahead of him, limestone and dry grass, and the enormous Montana sky, and somewhere ahead was a house where a woman was raising 3 daughters on the wrong side of grief, and somewhere behind him was a barn cat and a boy with good instincts, and a woman who had wanted to be seen and found in the worst week of her life, something she hadn't been looking for. He rode at an easy pace, no urgency, the October light long and gold on the valley below. There were things to do. There were always things to do. He would do them, and then he would come back. And that particular and specific intention, the turning toward rather than away, was the first thing he had been certain of in 3 years. He rode. The valley opened around him, wide and cold and full of sky, and the horse beneath him moved steadily forward, and somewhere in his coat pocket a ring waited for a finger it knew the weight of. Soon, not yet, but soon.